What's up, guys? Drew here. Thanks so much for stopping by and checking out the first episode of The Edge, where we sit down with Haynes Strader, Vice President of Data Center Solutions for CBRE. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. So don't forget to like, subscribe, and sign up for notifications so you don't miss out on any future videos that we drop. Now let's jump in to the interview. Welcome, everybody, to The Edge, a TMGcore production. Today, we are joined by Haynes Strader from CBRE. And what we're going to talk about today is data center trends and how that market has been shaping over the last couple quarters, and how the data center market is going, and some of the things that we see moving into the future, and how data centers are trending, buyers are buying, and just kind of the overall landscape. So, Haynes, thanks so much for joining us today. And we look forward to some of the discussions that we're going to kind of jump into. So just want to give you a minute to kind of intro yourself, tell everybody who you are, kind of what you're doing, and just anything that you think is relevant for people to know you, love you, like you.
Perfect. Yeah, Drew, thanks for having me, and TMGcore team, glad to be here. So my name's Haynes Strader. I work for CBRE. I'm a broker with our data center solutions practice. And so we're the largest real estate brokerage firm in the world, and the largest data center oriented platform from a brokerage perspective in the world. So my job is end users of data center space all around the world with their data center oriented transactions. So anything from leasing space in a building to buying a building to selling a building to acquiring land and going through a site selection process. We do it all. We work for large institutions and insurance companies, all the way down to startups that are kind of figuring out what they're doing in the space. A lot of tech oriented firms, but kind of all across the board. Any kind of data center oriented transaction, that's what I do specifically. And then CBRE more broadly does facilities management, project management, and a bunch of other services as it relates to data centers. So we've got a ton of research, and are constantly tracking market trends for our clients.
Oh, that's awesome. How long have you been with CBRE, or even been in the data center brokerage space?
Yeah, so I've been in the data center space for about 5.5 years, and with CB for 6 years. So most of my time focused on UPS systems and generators, not office amenities and loading docks.
Awesome. It's a little more interesting on that side, right?
For sure.
Yeah. So one of the icebreakers that we use, with our guests is, in your field, in your line of work, what is the kind of the most interesting, crazy, just off the wall thing that you've seen, whether it be, a transaction that you were a part of, or, something that was kind of a curveball left-hand turn in your industry that was just unexpected, not something that anybody kind of planned for, and it was just a wow moment, whether that's something that was a huge success that nobody predicted, or something that maybe was less than ideal in terms of its execution, but just a nugget for people.
Yeah, well, not to plug TMGcore too aggressively, but honestly, the rise of immersion cooling, I think, has been something that has really been out of left field for us, and not something we'd necessarily anticipated. And it's not just
Sure.
TMG; we're seeing it, down under GeoSolutions in Houston. CGG in Houston. There's a few groups that are really on the front end of this immersion cooling, and it changes the entire way that you look at how a data center works from an infrastructure perspective.
Right.
And so the amount of densities you can create, and the amount of real estate you need associated with it, is totally different than your traditional data center transaction. So I think that's been a really exciting trend for us, and it's been fun to learn. It's been fun to learn. I still don't know enough about it, and it still hasn't been adopted as massively as we would like to see. But we're finally starting to see some of our largest types of clients, dip their toes into that sector and start to experiment and really do more R&D type projects associated with it. I think the other piece that we really didn't expect I wouldn't have anticipated would be cryptocurrency. That's been a huge space, and it's all about, getting to the cheapest total cost of operations, cheap power, and cheap overhead. And so that's been a bumpy road for sure, watching that kind of come out of the ground. And I think we're seeing Texas emerge as one of the key geographic areas where it's possible to get massive amounts of low cost energy without, picketers outside of your property, like you're seeing in the kind of Pacific Northwest. So,
Right.
I think those are kind of honestly, those are the two things that I think are exciting and aren't something that I was expecting on a day-to-day basis in this industry, but it's certainly emerging, and I think we're going to see a lot more of it here in Texas.
Yeah, so that's interesting, and with the cryptocurrency thing, obviously to your point, it's all about cost of energy, and I know that plays a big part in buyers' decision-making processes, right? Because they're depending on the models that they're using in their data center spaces, whether it's an all-in model where they're not beholden to a price per kilowatt, or if they're using some sort of a metered power pass-through model or something like that. That cost of energy is a real big factor in their buying decisions. Where are you seeing some of the those power rates really come into play? I mean, obviously, to your point, in the Pacific Northwest, with some of the hydropower that they're doing up there, they're getting really low rates. And keep me honest, I think Texas is one of the lower rates in terms of power and cost per kW. Where are those trends kind of taking buyers in terms of their decision making processes?
Yeah, so I'll bifurcate that question a little bit. So from a data center, from a data center perspective, where you have redundant feeds and you have a higher level of reliability, you're not necessarily doing load demand response, or maybe you are, but you have kind of a guaranteed amount of uptime, and You've got generators in place and all that kind of stuff. Power rates, in the Pacific Northwest can get as low as kind of 2.5 cents. That'd be definitely on the lower end. In Texas, we're seeing rates anywhere from the low threes, 3 cents, 3.2 cents, up all the way to 6.5, 7 cents in the DFW area. In San Antonio, it's kind of between 5 and 7 cents. And then in Austin, we're seeing, Austin Energy is typically, it's regulated and it's a municipality owned utility. So we're seeing rates closer to that 7 to 7.5 cent mark. But then in the greater Austin area, when you get into LCRA, Blue Bonnet territory, that rate gets a lot lower than Dallas. What's kind of crazy is on the crypto side, especially if you own your own substation, you can get into the twos manageably, but the commitment has to be, in the 100 plus megawatt range to the utility to get to that kind of pricing.
Sure.
And so it's possible, but it's you've got to have serious dollars to commit to a project to be able to do that, and willing to commit to some term with the utility.
Gotcha. Yeah, and so one of the trends and that. So, in full, transparency, obviously, Brad Ashley and I, came out of the colo space prior to coming over to TMG. One of the trends that I, in 2019 and based on who you listen to and read, 2020 is going to kind of continue that in terms of the hyperscalers just eating up, massive percentages of the data center purchasing that's going on and building and land grabbing and all of that. Are the hyperscalers making their way into those markets where the power is a factor, or are they, with their budgets and what they're doing, able to assume whatever the cost is? I mean, what's really driving the hyperscalers buying trends right now?
Yeah, so it varies hyperscaler to hyperscaler. It's not all the same for each one. I think what we see from certain ones are, they're really driven by tax incentives and how the tax incentives are laid out in certain states. So you've seen, massive numbers of these hyperscale data centers go to Des Moines, Iowa, for example, which has very attractive tax incentives. It actually has a pretty high rate of power relative to a lot of these markets, but really low cost of land, a lot of tech talent availability, and not a lot of competition from, of industries in that area relative to being able to go acquire. There's a one of the large owners there manufactures lots of technology devices that a lot of us have, and they have thousands of acres of crop in Des Moines, and that's hard to replicate in other markets where you have the available power infrastructure and fiber infrastructure to support those kind of massive facilities. But we are seeing them come to Texas. They're all pretty much in the Pacific Northwest already.
Sure.
They were kind of the ones that got that market out of the ground. A lot of that is not only power costs, but also, intercontinental connectivity and getting to the subsea cables that go towards Asia is a really important factor for those markets. In Texas, in Dallas specifically, we've seen Facebook and Google deploy major projects here. We've seen Microsoft really as the primary user for San Antonio in a big way. And I think we will continue to see new deployments in various markets in Texas. Austin even has a hyperscale user. We can't disclose who it is, but they're primarily in colo in that market. So I think, and that decision I think was largely driven by talent and where their offices are. So each player makes kind of different decisions. I think a lot of it has to do with the regulatory environment, both incentives and laws that are good for those tech companies to be in. And I think Texas, frankly, has some wood to chop in that department relative to other states. We've seen Illinois, Georgia, Minnesota, Ohio, and other states, Arizona, come out with more sophisticated tax incentives in the last 3 years. And Texas's incentives are almost now 7 years old and just aren't up to date with where technology is. So I think to really drive the kind of hyperscale activity that we're seeing in Northern Virginia and even parts of California and Pacific Northwest, we need to adjust the way that we approach tax incentives for those types of companies.
So Haynes, on top of that, we've known each other for many years from my previous life in co-location. And I'm actually learning new channels that I didn't know then because I'm not in co-location anymore. They're sharing a lot of information with me that typically you wouldn't if I was a co-location sales rep. And so my question, kind of piggyback on the hyperscalers, is I feel like a lot of the news lately and a lot of the conversations I'm having, you saw about 24 months ago, these large hyperscalers buying massive amounts from colo providers. It doesn't really matter where in the United States, right? Hotbeds, you talked about them. I feel like the conversations I'm having now and the news I'm seeing, they're building. They're not really buying as much as they were. Do you feel that's the same? Do you feel that's right?
Well, kind of. So I think that they are building a lot. They're still leasing a ton of colo.
Okay.
They're still a major colo user. So if you look at Northern Virginia, we had 250 plus megawatts of net absorption in 2019. And, we're nearing 100 megawatts of leasing in the first quarter of 2020. That's absorption plus pre-leasing. So, that's largely driven by hyperscalers.
Okay.
But when you look at the Northern Virginia market, when you look at Ashburn, Sterling, kind of those key areas where a lot of the hyperscalers are, there's simply not land available for them to buy and build. So they have to lean on the large co-location providers in those markets that have acquired a lot of that space, or they've got to go out to Manassas and Reston. We did see Commerce and cloud provider buy big chunk of land in Northern Virginia for an unprecedented number. So I think you're seeing that happen still but the reality is it's both. It's not one or the other. And I think, frankly, if you look at what's going on right now, kind of regardless of what the trend was in Q4 2019 and where that was headed, if you look at what's happened because of coronavirus and COVID-19 and just the business impact that's having, everyone is leveraging their cloud services. So if you had a business continuity service in place, if you had virtual environments up for work from home, all that's being activated kind of all at once. And I think we're seeing a lot of organizations find value in these contracts that they had where they didn't have a data center where they could spin up their own infrastructure, and being able to do that virtually is really a boon for these cloud operators. So my guess is that we continue to see them grow in markets where they can either own and build or lease powered shell and build the infrastructure themselves and kind of own the expensive part of the building, they're going to do that. It's less expensive. It's easier to do. It allows them a lot more flexibility. But in markets that are tighter, when you think about even Dallas, Chicago, Northern Virginia, anywhere in California, the reality is you have to lean on these colo providers to be able to get in the right location, to get the right amount of connectivity, and for it not to take 3 years. A new project in Santa Clara is a 36-month project minimum. And so that's those lead times and the availability of sites is definitely a big thing. I know that one of the large hyperscalers that's been under some government scrutiny just due to their scale as a social media company has really to scale back on new build. So they apparently looking more at leasing, but we'll see how that all plays out. I think the reality is we're going to continue to see both.
Yeah.
Now, as a follow-up to that, Haynes, obviously going into the end of the year, Gartner said a whole lot about edge and what the edge is, and there's several different definitions of the edge, but from your perspective, given the transactions that you're a part of, have you seen an uptick in different customers wanting to develop sort of an edge strategy and kind of decentralize what's going on? Or is it just more of they're trying to get to different parts of the United States that they haven't quite been to? Like, from what you're seeing, what is kind of the definition of the edge from that perspective?
Yeah, so the way I define edge, and it's different based on what different companies are doing, but it's the ability to reach the maximum number of eyeballs with the lowest latency possible, and basically having scale compute it's having lots of hubs going back to a major lots of cogs going back to a major hub, right? So in order to do that successfully, I think we've seen large enterprises leverage edge-oriented compute companies. So we're seeing a lot of the folks that are the sort of on the bleeding edge of this are really the content delivery networks. So it's the Akamai's and Cloudflare and companies like that are deploying edge nodes today so that all of our streaming services work. I think, in my mind, that's the heaviest demand today on the edge, is getting to every household in America so they can watch Netflix and Hulu and whatever service they're watching.
Absolutely.
I think the biggest boon to come for that is really 5G. And it's the enablement of all of this Internet of Things, where suddenly everything in our house is talking to each other, and all of these devices need to be able to simultaneously upload the data that they're creating, have that analyzed and sent back to the end user. That's, just if you think about automated cars, I think the goal of automated cars, whenever that happens, and I don't think that's in the next 3 years, but it's probably in the next 10 years where we're really going to start to see that roll out. Most of the compute should happen in the car. So the car should have some very serious compute capabilities, so that, if there's a problem, you don't want your car buffering on the tollway and flying off a bridge. So it needs to be able to handle that if it loses connectivity or for whatever reason in the car. But it then needs to be able to send a massive amount of data. If you think about all the things that are happening in a car, somewhere to be analyzed and to improve the network and improve the reliability and all of that. And it can't just be when you pull in, today, if you have a pretty smart car, most of that's happening when you go get your car serviced. They're plugging into a hard drive, and then they're uploading all of that to a cloud somewhere or a data center somewhere that's analyzing it. So I think the amount of data that's going to arise from the ability through 5G is what's going to really drive edge computing. And I think the first places you'll see that are the CDNs, and then the network carriers who are providing a lot of those 5G services. And they may choose to partner with companies that are focused more on edge computing. But I think that's where that's headed. From our business, when I'm working with a large healthcare system or a bank, that's really a managed service. They're not doing that themselves too much. They're kind of managing their crown jewel compute and cloud services. And then if they have some need for an ancillary edge service, they're leveraging some partner for that.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, and so I was reading last night that from an edge standpoint, that the data that, well, let me just look at my things here so I don't misquote it. So there was a Gartner article that said by 2022, 75% of all enterprise data is going to be generated and processed outside traditional colo or cloud, and that's an uptick from 2018. It was less than 10% of that data was generated outside traditional colos. So are you, I guess kind of to Brad's question, are you seeing a trend where it's current operator, like your big known data center operators are starting to go micro out on the edge and building smaller into second and third tier markets? Or are you starting to see other players kind of pop up in that space? Or is it kind of a mix of both? Or how is the edge data center deployment kind of starting to shape up from what you've seen and then how you're seeing prospective trends?
Yeah, so from a colo perspective, we have definitely seen colo operators, particularly the privately held retail providers, deploying more and more in edge markets. So markets like Salt Lake City that didn't traditionally have big data center deployments and were really served from other sort of Western hubs like Las Vegas, Phoenix, Dallas, Chicago, is now really building its own data center infrastructure because of just the availability of power and fiber in that market has gotten a lot better. I think we're seeing more of the private guys find success there because there's a lot of local companies that are able to anchor those projects. I think you're finally starting to see the cloud guys, and this kind of goes back to Ashley's point. If they're going to build a 100 megawatt project, they're probably going to build it themselves. But when they want to go have a 500 kW or 2 megawatt node in a market, they're going to leverage a colo provider. And so we're seeing those guys have smaller deployments in regional markets that are more edge oriented to serve those needs. So I think you're going to, again, it kind of goes back to what I was saying, where I think you're going to see service providers going into those markets and creating the infrastructure so that it's an easy lever to pull for the enterprises that want to leverage edge when that time comes.
Sure.
So on top of that, in your opinion, because I know I have mine, the large, like take the top 5 colo or REITs providers, do you think that they will ever either be agile enough, finding the word to use, but agile enough or interested in having edge nodes and then connecting it back to, take Equinix, right? Take their backbone, for example. Let's say they decided they really wanted to get into the edge market. They're going to put it way, way out on the edge, draw the fiber to, back to 1950 Stemmons or one of the major carrier hotels. That's a new endeavor. That's money that has to go into that pot. That's a new team that has to. Do you think the big guys, are they talking about that? Do you think they're even looking at that? Or kind of like you said, the enterprise is going to look for vendors to do that. Do you think the large colocation providers would go step out on the ledge and do it themselves, or find a partnership to do that? Are you seeing those conversations?
That's a great question. And I think the answer, in my opinion, just from what we're seeing in the capital markets, is it's much more likely that they're going to the big REITs would acquire a private company that's already done that successfully versus trying to create something brand new. I think when you look at the amount of investment dollars flowing into this space, you can either go build a bunch of projects that works, or you can buy a business that's successfully proven that model. And I think there's enough private guys out there that their whole platform is built on an exit at some point, that's more likely of how the REITs are going to engage in that space. Could they go do it on their own? Probably. I think CoreSite and Equinix that are really carrier hotel oriented, they're so asset specific in the markets that they're going into new markets. If they don't control the core connectivity hub for that market, that's probably not a market they're going to enter. But if they can acquire a company that's successfully kind of created that ecosystem in a market that maybe didn't have it before, I could totally see that makes sense. But whether it could be any of the REITs that go down that path. I think eventually, and you look at what's going on, again, going back to COVID-19, you look what's going on in overall just market volatility. The data center REITs are much more insulated from what's going on any of the other REITs out there, or really a lot of publicly traded companies. And I think a lot of it is because people are seeing the value in controlling compute and network infrastructure. And we all still need it, whether we're quarantined at home or working from the office or wherever we are in the world. And if that was to all cease to function or not function correctly, the economy would really be in a lot more trouble than it is right now. So I think, in a way, we will probably see a lot more investment into the publicly accessible companies that, in other words, where investors can just buy stock versus necessarily making private equity investments and those kinds of things.
Okay, that's kind of what we were seeing. So I didn't want to just say, hey, this is what I'm saying. I want to see what work on the same page, because we now have the ability, not working for one colo provider, we're talking to all of them, which is neat, right? You sell colo for one for 6.5 years, and now you're walking into all the others. So that's been I think it's been a cool perspective for the people on the phone. Now we get to talk with the people that we are competing with. But no, thank you for your perspective on that. Was really interesting.
Well, I think when you look at the technology that you guys are creating, go reinvent the wheel if that's something that makes sense either as a product or a partnership for some of those colo operators. I think there's absolutely opportunity for that. And I mean, there haven't been a ton of 15 megawatt, deals, and one of those happened to be an immersion cooling, user. So I think there's opportunities out there for sure, and finding the right partner to help kind of roll that out is probably a good use of y'all's time.
Awesome. Now, Haynes, you mentioned the global pandemic that we're in. From that being said, is business still functioning as usual for you, and kind of where do you see things heading? Obviously, the end is unknown, but kind of what we're in and where we're at, how is business looking for you, and what do you project it to be in the upcoming 3 to 6 months to a year?
Yeah, it's a little hard to predict. I think as of right now, we are seeing everything that was kind of in motion, in process, is getting rushed to completion. Because nobody knows what their IT budget's going to look like in a month. If it's kind of been approved, everybody's trying to get everything done now so that they can go focus on all the volatility that's going on in everybody's business. If it was a new transaction or a new opportunity that was kind of being explored, a lot of that's being temporarily put on hold. Not very much of it's dying or not moving forward, but I think until we see light at the end of the tunnel, businesses are more, and it's not so much that they don't need to do it, but they're more apt to take care of their own business from an emergency standpoint and move forward with transactions. On the flip side, and part of the downside of being a broker is I spend a lot of time running a process where we're going to make sure our clients get the very best pricing, they find the very best site, it's competitive, we have lots of parties involved to make sure that it's a best-in-class transaction. Well, if you need to spin up 5 network servers right now by the end of the week, or your employees aren't going to be able to access their email or whatever, you're probably not going to worry so much about saving an extra 20 or 30% in using a broker. And so I think I'm not seeing all the transactions that are happening directly between a lot of the users in colo and their providers, that they're calling and spinning up services right now to accommodate their business needs in this crisis. I think, we're 2 weeks in. So I think in a month or two that will start to shift as people have kind of made the adjustments they need for the short term. From a long-term perspective, I think cloud is going to be a big winner in my mind. Microsoft was talking yesterday about how they're seeing record utilization of their Office 365 products and a lot of the Azure cloud products. And I think we're going to see increased attention to the services that can be provided there. That all assumes there aren't any major outages, and there haven't been yet to date. At least not in the United States. And I think the other thing we're seeing, I was really impressed maybe a month ago. It's been a month. Well, it was on the 6th of this month. So it's the 27th today. So 20 days ago, I walked into a tour and they had to check my temperature. I had to fill out a questionnaire. And so it seemed like the operators were well aware of what was coming and understood the issues that would arise if engineering staff and security staff and folks on the ground were to get ill. And so I think from an operational standpoint, we're seeing the data center operators be really responsible with how they're managing this crisis. And a lot of the public REITs have made announcements. Some of the private companies have made announcements limiting customer access and things that may honestly put them in hot water from an SLA perspective with some customers, and they're going to have to fight that out. But it's worth it to not create a situation where there's an outage in a facility or you're not able to maintain, the operations. The cool thing in a way is most of these data centers, the whole reason they're built the way they're built is for moments like this. The reason they have fuel contracts the way they have fuel contracts, the reason they have the redundancies that they have are to be able to run for an extended period of time when there is an emergency, when there is a lack of available resources and people. And so it's kind of, it's like, in a way, it's like being a soldier on the back end of a war, and you never get to see the front line. It's kind of neat to see all of these businesses activate on the front line, and it seems to be working today. We haven't seen a lot of problems, which is great.
That's awesome. And I mean, to your point, some of the customers that you have, how are they specifically handling that, potential limited access to the data center? Like, we've all been in the data center long enough, and we have all had customers that, they want to put it in a colo and never think about it, never see it again. And as long as it works, that's why we put in a colo, to the people who, if you could build a tent and put it in your colo cage, they'd be sleeping right there with it. So, from your perspective and the customers, how have you been seeing that, or how have they been reacting?
I think I don't think it's been a huge deal. I think everybody's been pretty understanding. I think this week has probably been the rude awakening for some customers as those policies have really been rolled out. But as you see what's happening in New York, and you see the scale of the growth of this pandemic, I think everybody kind of gets it. I think everybody's on board with their trusting their colo operator to have policies in place that's going to, an illness. And the industry, I think, responded well, shutting down conferences and things like that pretty early. I think you guys were the first ones I saw not going to a conference because of so that was good foresight. But it's a dynamic situation, and every deal is different, every client is different. It's definitely hard for businesses that need to keep running at full speed right now to have some perceived limited access. Obviously, it's probably not as big of a deal for a business that isn't having the kind of demand, but financial institutions, insurance companies, travel and logistics, all those kinds of things are high touch businesses right now. And so I think you're seeing kind of all hands on deck, but all hands on deck at home if possible.
That's right.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
For the first time, I actually started to receive calls from like some of my best friends from high school that I kept in contact with. And, we all kind of know what each other does, right? I've got some doctors and teachers, and I get what they do, right? But I've always said, well, I'm in data centers. And they're always like, oh yeah, that's cool. But they started to call me because they said, we're seeing all these national state homes, but data centers is essential. Like, a lot of the general public doesn't understand, like, if the data centers go down, almost your life ceases to exist. So it's just been really fun fielding phone calls. Like, okay, wait a second. Can you explain this to me? I'm like, yes. Use on a daily basis is going back to these large hubs and these. So I found it interesting over the last couple days, specifically, especially since Texas has started to go to stay at home, essential businesses only. I started to get those phone calls. So finally, we're being heard as a group.
No, that's right. No, that totally hit me when I was at the grocery store a week ago or something, and kind of getting supplies, and there's all these news stories about the grocery stores being ransacked, and I was amazed how much fresh produce and meat and fish and all of that was there. All the ingredients for an excellent meal, very easy to find, but box of Cheez-Its or processed foods, all gone. And what I thought was so funny about that is,
toilet paper.
Toilet paper and paper towels. I'm not anticipating seeing that for months. Yeah. But I think the reality is, people, if the internet quit working, people already don't know how to cook, and they really wouldn't know how to cook. I know my wife wouldn't be nearly the cook she is if she didn't have YouTube half the time. Or how to make something, and I need it desperately on the grill. So. But it is true. I mean, life has become so dependent on internet connectivity, and without data centers, none of that works. And without it, you're right. I mean, the economy would be the first thing to really cease to function, and then people would realize they'd never learned how to fish or change a tire, or, all the things that you need to survive.
Maybe plant some plants.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and that's a solid point too. We're blessed being in a major metropolitan area where, we have, massive availability to extremely high bandwidth, internet connectivity. But, for those that live in more, I don't know what a PC way to describe it, not major metropolitan areas, more outlying, places that, a 50 megabyte connection might be the best you can get. Right.
Yeah.
We're not seeing the effects of that, but I think, the last year or two, there's been a real big push for extending, major broadband out into, rural areas and those kinds of things. And I think that, at least I'll admit my own skepticism. It's like, well, do the people that live out in rural even really want it or need it? Right. But I think now you're seeing that, or at least I expect you will start to see a bigger push for extending broadband and 5G and those kinds of things out to and beyond the edge, as a result of this massive work at home, stay at home. Whether you're working at home or you've got 3 kids and to maintain some level of sanity, you've played Frozen 2 for 20 times in a day, to keep your kids from running amok. So I will be very interested to see how the 5G network and just broadband in general. Obviously, we're engaged in a lot of those conversations in terms of how that's deployed. But I think, once we kind of get a level set, whatever the temporary new norm is, and we kind of get beyond that, you're going to start to see a lot of those conversations of, okay, how do we prepare both from a health standpoint, right? Making sure we've got all of that, in the event that another pandemic like this were to ever happen, God forbid. But then also, I will be very interested to see how the technology preparation goes, and preparing for whether it's a health pandemic or a hurricane, any of those things. I think the technology is going to be something that people pay a lot more attention to in terms of disaster preparation, as at a mass scale. To your point, those of us in the industry understand it, but people outside the industry don't get why you need to be prepared with technology. It's just, hoard bottled water and toilet paper and you'll be fine. But the reality is our life is, is much more technology driven, data driven. So that'll be an interesting trend to see in the future as well.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. When we started at TMG back in October, right? I think it's almost 6 months now. Feels longer, but I understood the value proposition just in general about the edge, not TMG, but just the edge. And, but I did have those thoughts like, do rural communities really want telemedicine? Do they really want these things? But I live in Flower Mound, Texas, right? In the middle of Dallas, Fort Worth, and our allergist and our pediatrician, which happens to be Drew's wife, and all of these things, they're all going to televisits, but we have the ability to have televisits. But do those people and those children out in rural Oklahoma or Arkansas, I am now a first grade teacher. As of a week and a half ago, I didn't realize I was going to become a certified teacher, but I am. So I'm doing
emergency cert.
That's right, emergency certification. There was no process. It was here's the coursework, right? But we're blessed and I'm thankful.
Are you smarter than a 5th grader?
No.
No, I'm not.
I know a lot about quadrilaterals now, folks. But we're in a Mecca, so we have the ability to have this stuff. But I'm thinking about the families and the students. Now that I've become a teacher in the last week and a half, and I say that jokingly to any teacher that's listening. I'm not a teacher, but those families, are those kids getting the rest of their education for this calendar year? Do they have internet to support those kinds of things? So this is definitely, to Drew's point, piggybacking on that, I think is going to open the industry's eyes as to what real edge is and how we get those things out to every eyeball that needs them.
And Ashley, Drew, when you're talking about going out to those, tertiary, secondary communities, rural environments, who is going to be the driver of deploying that? Is that the carriers? Is that tower companies? Who's going to be the first to make those investments and in order to see some kind of return?
We're actually having these conversations. And it's been very interesting, right? Because a specific state came to us and they said, when you look at the state, when people think about this state, they don't think this state is rural, right? They think of these major metropolitan areas. Yes, there are some people that live on the outskirts, but they think of the major markets in that state. And I fell into that population, right? But they came to us and they sat with us for a couple hours and they said, the government, the state government, it was actually the local government on behalf of the state, said, we have these communities and there are, I think it was 125 school districts, thank you, that fall outside of these technology zones. So literally to break fix, they've placed Wi-Fi on the buses and kids go home and the bus finishes its route. And then all of these buses strategically are parked in places so the kids can walk back to the bus and sit on the bus to do their homework, right?
Wow.
I didn't even know that was going on, right?
Yeah.
We live in our bubble. We didn't even know. So from my opinion, I think Drew wanted to say something, but like, we're seeing the local governments coming to us first on behalf of the state. And then that state representative is actually coming in to see us. And whether it's us or somebody else, they need true compute on the edge so that these families, these school districts, because if we could put true edge nodes, right? And we define edge as the requisition comes in and it's not a node. So the requisition doesn't come in and then that node send it to a larger data center and then it come back. And then we say edges, requisition comes in, it's computed on site, requisition goes out, right? Almost zero latency. And so when we're able to do that, then it's able for these school districts that can't afford, I understand how much my PCs cost, but I didn't realize until we got into these conversations how expensive school computers have become. Mm-hmm. And for these schools in these districts that don't have the funds, right? Are we going to pay our teachers? Are we going to upgrade our technology? It's not upgrade the technology. It's pay the teacher and provide meals. That's a huge cost for students who can't afford it because most of the students in these areas, they can't afford meals. So they're having breakfast and take home in the afternoon. So that, and rightfully so, that's where the dollars are going. However, if there was an edge computing opportunity where so we're seeing the local government and the state come in, talk to us because we can put HPC on the edge. Then the carriers and the tower providers are getting involved because they could be the last mile. So you can take schools in rural communities and figure out where you want to drop these edge nodes and tie them in with fiber. And then they don't have to upgrade their technology, upgrade their software, which is a very, very small amount. And they make these older computers, machine learning, AI, telelearning modules, right? Without spending astronomical amounts of money. And now we're seeing the ISDs go, okay, wait a second. We can put a line item in our budget, an operating expense every year for that kind of service, right? Whether it's the state providing the service, right? That's still being worked out. But that's what we're seeing when it comes to who's using it. I actually see for the first time in my life, local and state government pushing it because they have to.
Yeah, that's cool.
Well, I can also chime in there because, as you guys know, my wife's in education, but, some of those issues are actually still here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Sure. And even in some of the school districts, because, being on the back end of hearing, part of the strategic conversations of, we are having to worry about, the kids who need to get fed, and the family stuff there, but there's plenty of kids in all of our local school districts that we live inside of our bubbles that you wouldn't think that don't actually have internet access. And so when these schools are being shut down and we're going, okay, hey, the easy button is remote learning. Well, to Ashley, to your point, with the conversation that got brought up that, we were all part of, the schools actually aren't built to be technology hubs. If you really think about it, there's only a handful of schools that are, in the early adoption or even majority adoption phase of a lot of technologies. A lot of the education systems are laggards. So when you look at, just from the standpoint of, for us, it's not that big of a deal to hop on a WebEx or a Zoom or anything like that and have a conversation. But to a lot of school districts, that's mind-blowing stuff of how do you do that when in reality it's, hey, here we have Office, send an email and we'll all meet in the conference room in 30 minutes and have this discussion. So there's to me, it's going to be interesting, from how technology gets adopted and how it gets implemented, which we've kind of been talking about a little bit, is, where do education systems fit and fall within that? And the local and state governments are now, going to be pushed to help out, because a lot of the funding for a lot of those school districts come from the state based on attendance and test scores and all of those things. But, I think this points out to, too, is, we have some companies that are responsible for, teaching youth that are falling behind and, not really adopting technology, but yet we expect all their kids to adopt technology, or all their kids have already adopted technology, whether it be on a phone or an iPad, but don't know how to use Excel or PowerPoint or something like that, which is being integrated in schools. But, from the way that, the workforce is going and how global reach of technology is anyway, we don't have kids who know how to get on Google Meets or stuff like that, which they're now having to learn, which is super fascinating to see. And, me candidly, because Ashley, you've been a teacher, my wife's at home teaching, and, it's kind of fun to see both the kids and the educators have to go through the same process of, well, how does Zoom work? Or, hey, somebody's yelling in the background. How, as the administrator of the call, can I mute that person?
Mm-hmm.
But to me, I also think it's going to bring kind of an eye-opening thing too of, we've had so many people who rely on credit cards and debit cards that all of a sudden something like this happens, and we talk about shutting down technology, and, if data centers were to shut down, we'd have a huge problem. Well, there's still a lot of people who don't have cash in their households, and so, to me, I'm very interested to see, how many of the folks that have been like anti, fully adopting technology, we all know people that, have 50 Alexas in their house and stuff like that, but there's still plenty of folks who are anti some of that stuff. How does that actually change? Or for, on the flip side, some of the people who, can't live without their phone touching, themselves 100% of the time, like, does this actually cause them to take a step back and go, hey, we need to look at how we use technology and how it integrates into our lives, and maybe take a step back a little bit. So I'm kind of curious and, fun looking at some of that stuff.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a massive reprioritization of how we leverage technology, to your point, Brett, because you have mass consumers of technology, and then you have people that are anti-technology, and I think you're going to see a lot of people coming to the middle. That's what I believe, because you're going to see those people that were laggards or just obstinate toward technology. Obviously, they're seeing a value in it, or they're being forced to adopt it, and then you're going to see those people, I think. You're going to see those people that are mass consumers of it on to a level that some would probably say is unhealthy. They're seeing like, oh, my kids are actually at home now all the time, and so I'm going to spend time with them, and I think you're going to start to again see a real prioritization and a move back to the middle on that part. And then Haynes, to your original question, I think you're going to see a lot, and you've already started to see it, right? Like the Zoom, as an example, they said during this period you're going to any educator or any kind of telelearning organization, they've offered their Zoom services to them for free, right? So that these school districts that maybe don't have the budget for something like that, they can use that to assist. And I think you're going to start to see a lot of those technology organizations start to pop up once we level set and we get on the other side of this, right? Because I believe we will restore back to some to maybe not exactly the way life was 3 months ago, but we'll get back to normal, whatever, to a very large degree. And once we get there, I think you're going to start to see a lot of those organizations pop up and say, hey, we've got the technology and we've got the ability to leverage our resources to start extending this out to the masses in a way that's meaningful. And we've been in conversations with some companies, that they have retail locations in a lot of these rural areas, and they're even getting into the conversations of how can we leverage the footprint that we have, in those rural areas to leverage technology as a hub in some of those centers. So I think it's going to be those guys, and then obviously you've got to have the feeds. So the tower companies, the carriers, and those guys are going to have to get involved just because the network's got to have an artery to run on. But I think it's going to be, I don't think you're going to see one company pop up. I think it's going to be a very holistic effort, especially after, something like this. I mean, those conversations were happening prior to COVID, but I think one of the things that COVID and Corona has done is really galvanized. It's galvanizing people together as, hey, we're all in this, Corona it doesn't care about age, race, socioeconomic level. It's affecting everybody equally. So we're coming together and we're going to fight this thing. And moving beyond, I think you're going to start to see a more holistic effort at leveraging what's available and the development is something you're going to see. People are going to start to develop new technology. You're already seeing an acceleration in some of that development. And I think it's just going to be exponentially increased as we move out of this phase. And one, just people seeing the benefits of it, and then also preparing for some sort of a disaster moving forward as well. So,
yeah, totally.
Yeah. So as we kind of wind down here, Haynes, I we've talked a lot about things that we've seen and interests that we have. Are there any trends or anything just newsworthy that you want to bring up or that you think is relevant? I know we kind of jumped in, but I want to make sure that we, if there's anything that you feel like we haven't covered that's relevant, I'd love to hear.
No, I mean, I think we've covered a lot of it. I think, one comment I'd make that just to kind of sum this up and think about moving forward is how we come out of this crisis and how companies decide, companies have been going through digital transformation for the last, 5 to 7 years, and what that means, whether that's going 100% cloud or going, 100% on-prem or whatever that is. We've seen a mixture of a lot of different things. And I think the most constant thread that we hear is hybrid infrastructure. And it's a mixture of, a bunch of different types of deployments, leveraging cloud where you need to, and figuring all of that out.
Sure.
I think this kind of event puts all that to the test. And I think you're going to have a lot of organizations coming out of this that didn't have what they thought they had in place, and it didn't work the way they thought it was supposed to work. And you're going to have some that it worked really, really well. But I think that's a huge opportunity for companies like TMGcore to get yourself out there and your technology out there as, a potential differentiator. I think you're going to have a lot of companies trying new things, realizing that safe and steady, for 10 years in IT is not usually actually safe and steady when it comes down to it. When your infrastructure is old and your systems and processes are old, and there's an event that tests your bandwidth at 100 times what was even capable when you originally designed your infrastructure, that kind of thing will change companies. And we're going to see, due to the economic environment, layoffs, a lot of pressure on costs. And to me, that's all good, for the IT world. I think that means that dollars are going to be spent purposefully. They're going to be spent on things that are moving the ball forward, and that should be good for the overall environment. Not just the technology environment, but also the real environment where people are, using greener technologies and stuff that's more power efficient, all that kind of thing. But absolutely, that's what I hope people will take from this from the technology side.
Absolutely. All right. So Haynes, how can, if people want to connect with you in terms of email, social, where if they want to learn about CBRE brokers, if they have a deal that they want to have you guys work for them, how can people get in touch with you? Yeah,
so you can find me on LinkedIn. It's Haynes Strader, INES, and you can Google me or just go to CBRE and search for me. But any of that's fine. I'm pretty on LinkedIn, and would love to get you guys connected with anybody. And then I've got, we publish quarterly and biannual research reports, and happy to share that with anybody that's interested.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Well, again, Haynes, thanks for joining us on this episode of The Edge. And guys, don't forget, anywhere you consume your podcasts, you can pick up The Edge, also at www.theedgetmgcore.com. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks so much for watching this first episode of The Edge. We really appreciate it. Now, if you have any questions related to anything that we talked about with Haynes in this interview, or if you just have questions in general about TMGcore, immersion cooling, or anything else related to what we're doing, please drop those questions in the comments section below. Our intent is in the future episodes, we'll take 1 to 3 or 4 minutes at the end of every interview and do a Q&A section where we answer whatever questions you drop in the comment section. So please drop those questions down there. Anything goes. We'll get to as many questions as we can at the end of every episode. And so you'll have to tune in if you drop a question in the comment section to our next episode in 2 weeks to find the answers to your questions. Also, don't forget to like, subscribe, and sign up for notifications so that you don't miss out on future content. Thanks so much, and we'll see you soon.